Well, I think it's strange that we gather like this on a day called Good Friday, a day which really had nothing good about it. The term might have come from the term God's Friday, but that day certainly looked nothing like it, as God was not having a very good day. But we gather tonight because we just can't move from palm branches to lilies without first entering the darkness and solemnity of the moment. As I read through the Gospels, trying to immerse myself in the story, I had to pause at one of the things that Jesus said. Luke 22 tells the account of Jesus and the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane. And as Jesus finished praying, the sounds of this oncoming mob started to grow. As they approach, Jesus knows this is not a friendly mob. Amongst them, he sees Judas, a disciple who had been with him all throughout his ministry. And he approached Jesus and he planted a kiss on him. This kiss wasn't just a kiss. People would greet with a kiss as a sign of affection or welcome, but this was a kiss of betrayal, a kiss of death, if you will. It was to help identify Jesus to those who came to arrest him. The disciples wanted to fight back. Peter tried. He wielded his blade and injuring one of the priest's servants, only to be scolded by Jesus once again. Put that sword away. And then Jesus healed the man and called for an end to the potential escalation of violence. Then he turned to the religious leaders and says, you know what? I've been around all week doing my thing. You had every opportunity to apprehend me in the light of day, but you didn't do it. Then he tells them, this is your hour where darkness reigns. What a powerful moment. What a powerful statement to make. Here, Jesus is playing both on the darkness of the night as well as the darkness of their souls and the darkness of their desires. Earlier in the chapter, we read that, Satan entered Judas. And while Judas may not believe that human beings could sink so low, Jesus knew how malevolent people can be. But Jesus is speaking to religious leaders and telling them that they are being ruled by darkness. Basically, that Satan is working overtime in the moment. That this is their moment. But Jesus' use of the word hour is so important here. Matthew's gospel tells us that when Jesus was praying in the garden, he noticed that his disciples had dozed off, and he tells them, could you just not sit with me for one measly hour? In other words, the text frames the hour as a short time, something that passes before you know it. And as ominous as the reign of darkness is, as much as those arresting Jesus think they've got him in the bag, it's only for an hour. But that hour will be dark, and it will not be very pretty. And there are times in our lives where we go through dark periods. For some, it's a time of unrest or sickness or loss. For St. John of the Cross, it was where God's presence seemed so far away that you experience this spiritual dryness. But dark times come to us, and in those moments, we might wonder where God is. We might ask, why did God allow this or that other thing to happen? And that question sometimes weighs more heavily on those that actually go to church and pray, and they still experience those dark moments. Good Friday is a great time to ask the question, why? Jesus called it what it was. It's a time when darkness reigns. That's what Good Friday was. From the time they got their hands on Jesus to the moment he breathed his last breath, darkness seemed to be in control. And maybe that's why we need to be together like this, to identify those times in our lives, in our world, where darkness had the upper hand, where it seems it's going to win the day. But you know about Good Friday, don't you? When darkness reigns. You know about the war in Ukraine. You know about the terrible treatment of women in Afghanistan and the refugee crisis in Syria and the Mexican border. You know about the subway stabbings. You know about the deaths and detriments caused by the pandemic. You know that miscarriages happen, that there are abusive spouses and parents. You know about children dying at the hands of angry and deranged people with weapons. You know about the unreliable economy. You know Good Friday. Well, Jesus' arrest was just the beginning. Then came the trial that would unmask the intentions of his adversaries. First, the high priests had their way with him. They beat him and they mocked him. They arranged for witnesses to interject damning testimony. They went to great lengths to condemn Jesus as a blasphemer and a seditionist against the temple and the empire. During this time, Peter, who had tried to have so many brave moments, who had tried to stop this from happening in the first place, when he was questioned by various people about his association with Jesus, what did he do? His resolve melted, and he denied his friendship and his discipleship with Jesus. He failed miserably, but understandably. And I'm sure he felt the weight of the darkness in that moment. He knew there was venom in those people who had Jesus in their possession. He knew there was one thing on their minds. They wanted Jesus dead. It had been their intention all along. But the religious folks had a problem because they had no jurisdiction to execute someone in this capital offense kind of way. Sure, they stoned many people, but that was in their own religious communities. That was different. They wanted Jesus to be made an example. So they brought him to the governor, Pilate, who couldn't understand why in the world they were bringing Jesus to him. Send him to Herod. It's his problem. Well, of course, Herod was thrilled that he might have an audience with this Jesus character who had called him a fox. He probably wanted to strut his stuff in front of Jesus. But Jesus didn't give him the satisfaction. Not one word. So back to Pilate Jesus goes. And even as the dawn was rising, the darkness was thickening. Pilate, not wanting to grant them their bloody request, tried to pull all the stops to save Jesus. But Jesus didn't come to be saved. He came to save. And I think Pilate eventually saw the futility in his efforts, and so he just washed his hands of the whole thing. After all, Jesus really did force the hands of the priest, of Caiaphas, of Governor Pilate, and he left them no choice but to get rid of him. And after more flogging, an already exhausted and bloody Jesus carries his crossbeam against his raw flesh that's torn from those beatings to his place of execution. You know, sometimes we forget that crucifixion was a very common form of capital punishment in those days. The Romans prided themselves in perfecting this torturous method of death that enforced their dominance. Other forms of capital punishment are quick in comparison. But with crucifixion, a person could suffer for days. And so it would be a deterrent for people who were considering breaking the law or going against the government. It kept people in their place. It carried the message to everyone that the people in charge are very powerful and they can crush you. And beyond the personal pain that it brought, it also brought embarrassment and shame on the family of the individual. And the disfigurement that went with it stripped the person of any shred of dignity. And then they put a sign above Jesus' head. And the sign read, "This is the King of the Jews." And everyone wanting to spin it how they might, Pilate would have probably emphasized, this is the King of the Jews. Whereas the religious leaders who took great offense to it would have said, this is the King of the Jews? But for Jesus, I think the pain of the cross paled in comparison to being rejected by those he came to heal and save. Even those closest to him abandoned him as they didn't really understand what this whole Messiah thing was supposed to be about. But at about the third hour of Jesus hanging on that cross, we read that darkness came over all the land. And it's unlikely that this darkness was caused by some cloud cover or eclipse, because Passover occurred during a full moon, and a solar eclipse can only happen during a new moon. This was nothing less than divine darkness. It was God kind of turning out the lights. In some ways, it could have been a sign of judgment. It may have been God not wanting to shine a light on the evil of humanity. Of course, in the book of Exodus, we see an example of divine darkness when God sent the plague of darkness to Egypt. In the book of Joel, the day of God's wrath is described as a day of darkness and gloom. Because after all, if God is light, then the antithesis of that has to be darkness. And this was the hour when darkness reigned. On the cross near the end, Jesus cried the words, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And these words come directly from Psalm 22, and Psalm 22 has often been called the Psalm of the Cross. And I think it's appropriate that the Son of David cries the prayer of David. And by praying that prayer, Jesus is saying he is not alone in his suffering. And he acknowledges that people have been crying out that prayer forever. And he is absorbing that prayer for all humankind. But I think that's a prayer that you've prayed. God, where are you? Why do I feel abandoned in this moment? But the cross is nothing if not the place where Jesus identifies with humanity. It's God entering and experiencing the cumulative darkness of humanity. When Jesus prayed in the darkness of the garden before being arrested, he prayed that there might be a way for him to avoid this, to pass that cup of suffering by him. But he ultimately said to his Father in heaven, "Not my will, but yours be done." And it takes me back to the Old Testament story of Jonah, knowing that God wanted him to go to Nineveh, a city that Jonah despised. Jonah made arrangements to go the opposite way. God wanted to bring forgiveness to those people. Jonah wanted no part of it whatsoever. And then Jonah found himself in a predicament. While he was en route, escaping God's plan, he was jettisoned from the boat he was on, and he found himself in the belly of a large fish. And for 3 days, he experienced darkness, and probably not the greatest smell. In fact, I'm pretty sure he gave up fish for a while after that. But while Jonah entered darkness running from the will of God, Jesus entered it in full submission to God's will. I've always thought of the events of Good Friday being the cry of humanity saying, if I ever get my hands on God. And God's response is, here I am. Give me the worst you've got. That Good Friday, the enemy was having a field day. This was the culmination of thousands of years of planning, saying, I'm going to put that God in his place. Now, in this story, I know there are a few moments where you wonder, can Jesus maybe escape this whole situation? Can he escape death? The religious leaders don't really have enough witnesses. Pilate seems to be favoring Jesus a little bit. And then he puts Jesus into the hands of the crowd. And maybe God will step in at some point and save him. But at every one of those moments, we face disappointment. I also feel for the disciples who had to live with how they disappointed Jesus. Probably saying, last night, Jesus fed us, remember? He washed our feet. And what did we do? We left him in the garden. We denied that we even knew him. There is nothing good about today. As Jesus hung on the cross, he looked out at those who held him in such high contempt. And what did he do? He asked God to forgive them. Forgive them because they did not know what they were doing. And I think those are probably some of the most mind-boggling words that Jesus spoke. At least to me they are. But Jesus knew that darkness had also overtaken them. Because with every word, with every miracle of Jesus, they shut the doors of their lives and their institution until they were left in darkness. Thomas Merton, maybe one of the greatest theologians of the 20th century, wrote, "We stumble and fall constantly, even when we are most enlightened. But when we are in true spiritual darkness, we don't even know that we've fallen." Well, Jesus came to confront our brokenness, our fallenness, our hostility to the things of God. And from the cross, Jesus shone a light on those religious leaders. From the cross, he revealed the hardness and the darkness of their hearts. And even though their darkness was self-inflicted, he prayed for their forgiveness. I'm sure that's a message the disciples also welcomed, maybe with a sigh of relief, as it might have led them to think, man, if Jesus could forgive them, maybe he can forgive me. And that gives me hope for life. I pray that I will never be taken to a place that is so dark that I don't even know when I fall, that I can't recognize my hostility or the hardness of my heart. And that's something good that I take from Good Friday. That God knows my hurts, that God knows my own darkness. And I know that that same forgiveness that was offered that day on the cross is offered to me and to you, if we just open the door just enough to start letting the light of Christ come in. Because Jesus wants us to be free from our self-delusion, and he wants to lift the scales from our eyes so we become more attentive to God's goodness, and so that we can receive and treat others as God would, even those who betrayed us. Because that's the beginning of the gospel. That's the good news. God isn't pointing at the cross of Jesus and saying to us, look what you made me do. Jesus didn't go to the cross as some sort of revenge plot. God is not out to get us, to get that pound of flesh from us. In fact, I like the way Nadia Bolz-Weber puts it. She says, God isn't standing above the cross. God is hanging from the cross. That's sacrificial love, best defined, perfectly demonstrated. And so, we are invited to face the darkness of Good Friday before jumping to embrace the light of Resurrection Sunday. We are reminded that in the shadow of death, we are to keep walking. We don't let those momentary circumstances consume us. We don't wallow in sorrow longer than we should. So tonight you may be going through something in your life that is dark, ominous, overwhelming. And the first thing Jesus promises you is that he's been there. He's taken the burdens of humanity upon himself. And unlike the disciples, he's not going to fall asleep on you. He's with you. He will go through the darkest hour with you. These things we go through might seem like they last for an eternity. But in the light of eternity, it's just an hour. So you might have a diagnosis you never expected. You may have lost a loved one unexpectedly. I think of one of the young men who grew up in this church, and in his middle years, he passed away like that just a few months back. He was a great father and husband and athlete, and yet death came early. There may be someone you love who is going through internal darkness, so much so that you fear for them. And there are so many people who are suffering from depression and PTSD and loneliness and paranoia. And it seems as if darkness has this lasting grip on them. But darkness will not last forever. Darkness doesn't win. Jesus came to absorb and redeem the darkest moments of your life and of mine. I think the prophet Isaiah said it best, and I'd like us to read it together. He says, "Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." So for all who feel betrayed or abandoned, for all who have been made fun of or ridiculed, all who have experienced injustice, all who are weary, Jesus has taken it upon himself. Darkness will not reign forever. But tonight we recognize that for an hour it did. And sometimes it still rears its ugly head. For an hour it falsely accused, beat up, spat upon, humiliated, and nailed the Son of God to a cross and buried him in a tomb. And that's what the followers of Jesus were left with on that Good Friday. And that moment felt like an eternity, asking, "What now? How could you leave us like this?" And that's how we're going to leave it tonight. So as you go out from this place, don't rush into the events of the coming days. Allow yourself the time to mourn the death of Jesus. Contemplate the betrayal and the denial he experienced. Stay by the cross a little longer. Be aware that God is with you, even in life's darkest moments. Amen. Peace be with you.